Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time it is that you're watching this. We are really glad to have you here with us at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church Sunday School. It's a little chilly today, outside and in the studio, but I hope that you will be warmed up by the information that we'll learn about the intertestamental period. Last week we talked about the battle between Xerxes and the Spartans and a variety of sorts of things that happened. And finally, we got to Alexander the Great, who is perhaps the most important figure in the intertestamental period, at least one of the most important. And we remembered that Alexander was born as a son of Philip and tutored by Aristotle. He carried either Aristotle with him sometimes, and sometimes he carried a book by Aristotle. Philip, his father, minted coins in honor of Alexander, and you can see them there. But Alexander was able to conquest virtually anything that he wanted. So the flanks, you remember that was the people holding shields and long spears. That was perfected by Philip. Philip, though, was assassinated in 336 BC, and Alexander then consolidated the control. And he had 30,000 troops to begin his conquest. And as he went on, he began to get more and more and more troops as he was able to widen his conquest. There are lots and lots of stories about Alexander and about his leadership. I'm not sure that most of them are true. His father, actually, Philip, was a better general, really, when you look at it, than Alexander. So Alexander might better be called Alexander the Mediocre. But he had these legends about him. One of them was, for example, that he would go to a particular city and ask them to give up or wave the white flag or surrender to him. And they would say, "Why should we surrender before a battle has even taken place?" And he would say, "Let me show you what my men will do for me." He would line his men up in front of a cliff and tell them to start marching. And they would march off the cliff to their death until Alexander told them to stop. He said, "I have maybe 40 or 50,000 other men who will do that for me. Do you want to fight or do you want to give up?" And of course, most of them would give up, wave the white flag and say, "This is crazy. We need to just give up." And so Alexander, he began to get more and more and more larger and larger areas of which he was controlled. And his men got farther and farther and farther away from home. And there were a variety of things that Alexander's conquest did that affected the New Testament. One of them is that Alexander caused Greek to be spoken by almost everyone with no dialects. So before Alexander, Greek had a variety of different dialects, and it was difficult sometimes for people to understand one another. Even though they spoke Greek, it was a different dialect. Alexander's soldiers needed to be able to speak to one another. And so what happened was all of these dialects sort of went into this great big pot and came out as a common language. Koine is the Greek word for common, and in the New Testament is written in Koine Greek. It was a Greek for the common man. It was the Greek that virtually everyone spoke. And as a result of that, the fact that the New Testament is written in the common kind of Greek is due to the influence of Alexander. Another thing is that Alexander also caused Greek food and customs to be adopted, which violated Judaism. So, for example, if you were Greek, you were circumcised, and there are you were uncircumcised. And so there are examples in Josephus of people who wanted to be Greek, because that was one of the great questions. Are you going to hold on to your Judaism, or are you going to assimilate into the Greek culture by learning the language, by eating the Greek food, by doing something about your circumcision? And since Jewish boys were circumcised at the time of their birth or shortly thereafter, 8 days thereafter, Josephus talks about, and Paul even mentions, a reversal of the circumcision. We don't know how that all worked out and don't care, but there were some who were so desirous to be Greek and to be seen as Greek rather than Jewish that they would eat whatever, regardless as if it were wrong for them to eat it or not. So think, if you will, with me, when I was a student in undergraduate school in college, I went to a small, very fundamentalist college called Bob Jones University. And there were certain boundary markers. Whenever one went off campus, a male had to wear a tie. So if you saw a young man with his hair cut really short, walking around with a tie on, you knew that he was from Bob Jones. There was just that may as well have been a giant sign around our neck. We're from Bob Jones. You weren't allowed to take the tie off once you got off campus. If someone found out that you did such a thing, you could be up for lots of problems. Those were our boundary markers. Fundamentalist Christians didn't smoke or drink alcohol. Fundamentalist Christian females didn't wear pants. There were a variety of very specific kinds of rules like that. And these are in some ways kind of like the rules that existed in Judaism at the time. These were their boundary markers. Their boundary markers were that Jews were circumcised, that there were certain things that Jews and Jewish people didn't eat, and certain things that they did eat. And as a result of that, these boundary markers began to sort of be broken down by people who wanted to assimilate and be part of the Greek culture rather than be holding on to their Judaism. And so Alexander caused, not so much intentionally, but just by the nature of what he was doing, caused many of these boundary markers to be broken down. And these boundary markers continued, and debate about the boundary markers continued until the destruction of the temple. You remember that Paul, in writing to Galatians, one of the great questions of Paul in the book of Galatians is it necessary for someone to become a Jew before they become a Christian? Because you see, Judaism is the grandfather, if you will, of Christianity. Christianity comes out of Judaism, and Jesus Christ was Jewish. And as a result, there were some who said, before you become a follower of Christ, you must first become Jewish. And in order to do that, you have to be circumcised. You have to eat certain food laws. You have to obey the food laws. And you remember that that's the great argument that is happening in Galatians. It's an argument that happens between Peter and Paul. And now I think that you can begin to realize that these questions about circumcision and food laws that seem so strange to us when we read about them in the New Testament, they are more important than they might seem, because they are the boundary markers. This is the world that Alexander essentially was able to add as his conquest. All around from Macedonia down through Greece, down through Mesopotamia, all around, then down through Egypt. He essentially conquered the entire known empire of the entire known part of the world. Alexander was the king. His final victory was Egypt, and Egypt was taken in about 332 to 331. Again, these dates are basic and approximate. And Darius, who was the king of Egypt at the time, Darius III, he was finally defeated. And Alexander killed Darius because of his, Alexander was sorry about the assassination of Darius, but Alexander himself was glorified because of all of the things that he had done. Coins and statues began to depict Alexander as a god. He was deity. He was a deified person. And you can see here that there are Alexander's name in an Egyptian cartouche. You can see coins bearing the face of Alexander. And you can see that Arian publishes what is called the Anabasis of Alexander. That's this book that you can see here, right there, that still exists today, written in Greek, and you get in Greek on one side and English on the other, so that you can read that about the conquest of Alexander even today. This is the Middle East as it looks today. It's called Saudi Arabia and different from Babylonia. Egypt is still basically called by the same name. And you can see that Jerusalem and what modern day Israel is right here. And that will become important because we see Syria here and Egypt here. That will become important after the death of Alexander. Because what happened was Alexander dies in about 323 BC, right after he has overcome Egypt. And there are some who argue that he died as a result of overuse of drugs and alcohol. There are others who argue that Alexander was poisoned. Alexander's son at the time was an infant, so he couldn't take over for his father. As a result, there were a group of leaders called the Didache, and the Didache took over different parts of Alexander's entire realm because it couldn't go to just one person. And so what happened, what's particularly important to us, are the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And they fight for control of the empire. The Seleucids and the Ptolemies, while there are others in other parts of the empire, these are the two that are critically important to Israel. The reason is that the son of Antiochus ruled Babylon and Syria, which is up to the north of Israel. And Ptolemy ruled Alexander down to Memphis in Egypt, of course, not Memphis, Tennessee. And there were, during that time, at least 5 major wars. And these wars were between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And you can imagine from that map that we saw a few moments ago what was right in the middle of that fight. It was Israel. And so Israel became this sort of fighting ground about which the Ptolemies and the Seleucids would fight just to decide who was in control of the more ground. And so here we can see the Seleucid Empire in the green. This is the Seleucids. It's up into here. Israel is right here. And this is Alexandria, Egypt. So in essence, the Seleucids controlled up to the north of Israel. The Ptolemaic Empire, on the other hand, is Egypt and down to the south. And here, of course, is Israel. So they, at certain times, controlled the land of Israel. Eventually, though, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids stopped fighting with one another. When that happens, something incredibly wonderful happens. And that is, certain Jewish people begin to take over their land once again, and they are called the Hasmoneans. And there are a variety of different Hasmoneans. There's Mattathias, Judas Maccabees, whom you've probably heard of, the Maccabean War, Jonathan Maccabees, Simon Maccabees, John Hyrcanus, Aristobulus, Alexander Janus, Salome Alexandria, Aristobulus II. There are a variety of different Hasmoneans. And what happens is that Antiochus Epiphanes, who is essentially thinks that he is in control of the land of Israel at that time, he wants to capture Egypt because he's from up north, and he fails to capture Egypt, but he gets really angry against those whom he did capture, which were the Jews. So he decided, and this is Alexander the Fourth, or Antiochus the Fourth, or Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus outlaws Judaism. He destroys scrolls of the Torah, and pork is to be eaten not just if one wants to, but pork is to be eaten as a command of Antiochus Epiphanes. So Antiochus is saying these food laws that you have held to be so significant, they don't make any difference anymore. As a matter of fact, you are bound by law to break them. And at this point, it becomes really significant in terms of the question, are you going to be Jewish, or are you going to assimilate with those that are around you? So Antiochus outlaws Judaism, he burns the scrolls, he does all kinds of things like that. Antiochus believes himself to be a god. The legend on this coin that you see here says in Koine Greek, it says, a coin of King Antiochus, God manifested conqueror. And so those who resisted the king's decrees are tortured, and some of them are killed. You can read about these kinds of stories in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, because they tell us about the Maccabean period, when the Maccabeans, who are the Jewish people, are doing their best to try to take Israel back from the rule of Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus oppressed many. And so here's a line from 2nd Maccabees. Some express their faith in God. By giving up my life now, I will show myself worthy of old age and leave to the young a noble example. So many simply said, rather than obey Antiochus Epiphanes, I'm ready to give up my life. Some hated Antiochus, and they would say, you accursed wretch, you dismiss us from the present life, but the King of the universe will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life, because we have died for his laws. They are saying they have died for the laws of God rather than for the laws of Antiochus, and God would eventually redeem them. Then there was the Maccabean Revolt, and essentially this is a gathering together of men who are led by the Maccabeans, and they decide that they are not going to listen to Antiochus anymore. They're going to actually break the law. And so the text says, then the king's officers who were enforcing the apostasy, they were enforcing apostasy commanded by Antiochus, they came to the city of Modane to make them offer sacrifice. So they were forcing them to offer sacrifice to a false god. But Mattathias, that is Mattathias, who was part of the dynasty of those who were going to fight against Antiochus, Mattathias answered and said in a loud voice, "Even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him and have chosen to do his commandments, departing each one from the religion of his fathers," that is, departing from Judaism, "yet I and my sons and my brothers will live by the covenants of our fathers." This comes from 1 Maccabees. Again, you can find the books of Maccabees on the internet. You can find them in a Roman Catholic version of the scriptures, generally in the middle, in between the Old and the New Testaments. So part one of the Maccabean Revolt was simply the desire that Mattathias said, we are not going to listen to what King Antiochus Epiphanes has told us to do. Then there's a second part. When he had finished speaking these words, a Jewish man came forward in the sight of all the others to sacrifice upon the altar in Modane, according to the king's command. He's going to sacrifice pork on an altar that was supposed to be for the Lord. And when Mattathias saw it, he burned with zeal. His heart was stirred. He gave vent to righteous anger. And he ran up and he killed him on the altar. And at the same time, he killed the king's officer who was forcing them to sacrifice. And he tore down the altar. And thus he burned with zeal for the law, as Phinehas did against Zimri, the son of Salu. This comes from 1 Maccabees chapter 2 again. And then is when the Maccabean Revolt really happens. This is part 3. After Mattathias has begun it by saying, we're not going to be taken and treated this way, Mattathias cries out in the city with a loud voice, saying, let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me. And he and his sons fled to the hills and left all that they had in the city. And then many who were seeking righteousness and justice went down to the wilderness to dwell there, they and their sons and their wives and their cattle, because evil pressed heavily upon them. So they become this sort of guerrilla band of warriors. They strike quickly against the army of Antiochus, and then they run away in a sort of beginnings of guerrilla warfare. And so this is the beginning of the war in part 3. Then the Maccabean Revolt, part 4, is that there are many battles. Apollonius is defeated, and there's this magnificent scene in 1 Maccabees. The warriors for Antiochus are using elephants as a beast of warfare. And those who are fighting on the side of righteousness and those who are fighting for Judaism, even though the elephants are coming after them, they stand underneath the elephants with the sword. And even though it means certain death to them, they kill the elephant and thus show that it doesn't matter. They will rout those who are against them. And General Lysias, men who are, some of who are Ptolemaic, they are defeated, and Simeon and Jonathan, those are two of the Maccabeans, they have great success in 1 Maccabees 5. And it's at this point that Antiochus vows revenge. And while he was in Ecbatana, news came to him of what had happened to Nicanor and the forces of Timothy. Transported with rage, he conceived to the idea of turning upon the Jews the injury done by those who had put him to the fight. So he ordered his charioteer to drive without stopping until he completed the journey. So what's happening is they have now gathered together in the temple, and they are expecting God to protect them, the Jewish people. And during this time, they light a candle or a menorah for the temple. They only have enough oil to last for one night. But through a miracle of God, the oil lasts 8 nights. And that's where we get the celebration of Hanukkah. It comes from this battle against Antiochus. And Antiochus is very angry about what's going on. He tells his charioteer to drive him there as fast as possible and not to stop. But the judgment of heaven rode with him. For in his arrogance, this is Antiochus, in his arrogance he said, when I get there I shall make Jerusalem a cemetery of Jews. This is in 2 Maccabees. He is riding as fast as he can in his chariot, and he said he will destroy the temple and make Jerusalem a cemetery, a total cemetery. But the all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, struck him in an incurable, unseen blow. As soon as he ceased speaking, he was seized with pain in his bowels, for which there was no relief, and with sharp internal tortures, and that very justly, for he had tortured the bowels of others with many strange inflictions. Yet he did not stop his insolence, but he was even more filled with arrogance, breathing fire in his rage against the Jews and giving orders to hasten the journey. And so it came about that even though he has some sort of bowel problem, he fell out of his chariot as it was rushing along, and the fall was so hard as to torture every limb of his body. And thus he who had just been thinking that he could command the waves of the sea in his superhuman arrogance, and imagining that he could weigh the high mountains in a balance that was brought down to the earth and carried in a litter, making the power of God manifest to all. And so the ungodly man's body swarmed with worms. And while he was still living in anguish and pain, his flesh rotted away. Apparently he had some sort of leprosy or infection. And because of the stench, the whole army felt revision and revulsion at his decay. You see there a death mask of Antiochus Epiphanes. And so what we have at this point is the Hasmonean Kingdom. This is the time when Israel is reigned and run by and ruled by the Hasmonean Kingdom. That is, it was ruled by Jewish people again. They had taken back their land, and it was theirs. They had taken back their temple, and it was theirs. And finally, they were back where they had been before, and Jewish people were in charge of the land of God again. Despite the fighting of Alexander, despite the fighting of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, despite the fighting of Antiochus Epiphanes, now they're back in charge. But, as you might know, it doesn't stay that way. And next week we'll talk about what happens to the Hasmonean dynasty. We'll talk about how the Hasmonean dynasty falls to the great and powerful Roman government. to the Roman government that is in control of virtually all of that part of the world at that time. We'll talk about why the Roman government was so important and why it makes such a difference in the lives of the people who lived during Jesus' day. But for today, you can remember, it's because of Alexander that we have a Greek New Testament. It's because of Alexander and Antiochus Epiphanes that we have these battles over what one should and shouldn't eat. And it's after Antiochus Epiphanes, because of the battles that are fought between the Antiochus Epiphanes and the Hasmonean dynasty, or the Maccabean War. It's because of that that we don't celebrate, but Jewish people celebrate the miracle of Hanukkah. And if you've ever seen a dreidel, if you've ever seen little Jewish children playing with a dreidel, it's a four-sided top, and on it is the beginning of a Hebrew word that says, a great miracle happened here. It's to remind them, even after the Roman government takes over, it's to remind them that their God is still on the throne and that their God is going to come back and one day make them the sort of place that they had been. So next week, we'll talk about the fall of the Hasmonean dynasty, the rising up of the Roman dynasty, and it will be an incredibly important set of lessons for us as we begin to understand how Herod becomes in control during the time of the birth of Jesus, and how Herod is able to then kill little children in the town of Bethlehem. All of those kinds of things are things that we begin the New Testament with, but unless we know the background to it, it doesn't really make any difference to us. So, take a minute, look up Alexander the Great on the internet, or look up the Hasmonean dynasty on the internet, or read First Maccabees. You'll find some amazing stories, and they are stories of, they're not in our copy of the scriptures, but they are nonetheless stories of the goodness and the graciousness of God. So we will look forward to seeing you next week and to remembering that even though the Hasmoneans controlled Israel at this time, things change and the Roman government comes and takes over. Until then, I hope that the Lord will bless you. Thanks so much for watching the Coral Ridge Sunday School. Next week we'll continue with our study of the intertestamental period, and then eventually we'll get to the New Testament and begin looking at each book of the New Testament in the same way that we looked at each book of the Old Testament. Until then, I ask that the Lord will bless you, that you will remember this wonderful time of the year in which we celebrate His birth, and that you will be gracious to others no matter how they treat you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.